tragedy.
Steve, I think what happens is that in this high-tech world in which we all live these days, we expect these things to go off flawlessly. We expect all kinds of what would be considered minor miracles just 10 years ago to be part of our routine lives. And I think maybe that television has contributed to some of that as well, because we've covered a number of these launches. They have been quite beautiful. I can tell you, as one who has watched a number of them from where Steve Delaney is today, it's an exhilarating experience. It seems as if nothing can go wrong. After all, we're putting a 37-year-old woman school teacher on board the space shuttle. There's a lot of excitement about that.
Well, that's what I meant about...
But it's a very complicated piece of machinery, and it is highly volatile.
Well, it certainly was this morning. Christa McAuliffe was selected, as you recall, over the about 11,000 other applicants, all of who wanted to get in on this program. There have been 1,400 or so journalists who have submitted their names in a deadline that recently passed to be the first professional storyteller to go into space and turn around and come back and try to increase the knowledge of what's been going on. They used to say about astronauts that they were very good pilots and not very good poets, but the idea was to try to make the kind of magic that the space program had become more available to people who had no special training as perfect physical specimens or test pilots. A long way between a 37-year-old lady school teacher and the kind of people who we had with the Glens and the Shiraz and the first crop of astronauts who flew the Mercury program out of here so many years ago.
Steve, we have the first reaction from Nancy Reagan, who was watching, it turns out, the launch of the shuttle this morning in the private quarters of the White House, and one of her spokespersons said that Mrs. Reagan's reaction immediately was, "Oh my God." She watched in shocked disbelief, we're told. She said that she would start praying for some thread of hope. Tragically, as well, not only were 1,200 students of Concord High School, where Mrs. McAuliffe taught, watching this on television today, but at the Cape itself, her family was assembled. Her husband, Stephen, and two small children, a boy and a girl. Young Scott and Caroline were there watching, too. That, I believe, is her mother and father. They appear not to know quite what's going wrong. Now, the realization. McAuliffe's parents watching today at Cape Canaveral. You could hear the NASA commentator in the background say there's a major malfunction. Now I think it is beginning to dawn on them that something terribly is wrong. You can hear another NASA official in the background saying, "Let's get out of this area." At the Senate press gallery, Senator Jake Garn, the first civilian to go up in the space shuttle, talking to reporters now. Let's go there.
All right. Your reaction to what happened today?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system. and I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up, and then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator, you're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids, we don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
What was your opinion of the amount of missions that NASA had scheduled for this year? Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program was mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter, yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving.
Senator,
I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally, during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. We woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and that does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator, how lucky do you feel today that you returned safely?
Well, I don't feel particularly lucky. I think the program is reliable. In all programs, in flight test programs for aircraft, we have accidents. And I don't, it's a surprise to me that it happened, but I would go again tomorrow. If NASA would let me go, I would go again.
What effect is this likely to have on the community of astronauts?
Well, first of all, they're all such a close-knit group. They're not looking any beyond today except the sorrow of losing some of their companions. You go through each one. I knew Christa McAuliffe the least of them because she wasn't there. Greg Jarvis I trained with, Dick Scobee I knew, Mike Smith was my mother hen, and you go, Onizuka flew in January last year when I was flying, so it's, and where they live together all the time, they train together, they fly together, there's obviously utter shock and disbelief down at Houston today among the astronaut corps.
On your mission, was the crew equipped with parachutes and were there ejection seats?
No, only Columbia had them at the beginning of the mission, just during the first, I don't remember, 3 or 4 missions.
Senator Jake Garn, thank you very
much.
Thank you, Senator.
And obviously and understandably shaken Senator Jake Garn, who knew, of course, the members of that crew because he had trained with NASA and had flown just a couple of missions ago on one of the space shuttle flights. He's a veteran fighter pilot, and he was obviously very shaken by what happened here today. Dan Molina in Houston, any additional information at the Johnson Space Center?
Tom, we are hearing absolutely nothing new at this point. The NASA Select, which is the broadcast system which gives us information get into their proper telemetry for flight. We are seeing now a picture of Mission Control. There is absolutely nothing happening in there right now. The people are glued to whatever information they can get off of their monitors. There are very few muscles twitching. Now, as you see there, right under the word Houston, that is where the flight director sits. He is the man who is in complete charge of this. And you can see them just sitting there waiting for the analysis through their computers of the computer information and the telemetry information that they were getting at the time. Behind the flight director is seated the flight operations director. He is the man that communicates with the NASA administration during these launches.
Yeah, Dan, if you were listening to Senator Garn, as I know that you were, it does appear that what happened is they went to full throttle to 104% on those main engines at the back of the spacecraft that are fueled by that big external tank. That's the orange tank that you see, 560,000 pounds of oxygen and hydrogen, as they push down, in effect, to go to full throttle as they were lifting off into their orbit, they hoped. That appears to be the moment when everything went wrong, when the explosion had occurred. And of course, if there was any malfunction whatsoever, that big external tank is a bomb in effect. And that's really what it is. It's a huge external tank filled with a highly volatile material. And it appears that's when things went tragically very wrong indeed.
Yes, Tom, indeed. As we were hearing from Bob Bazell and Roy Neal earlier on, the astronauts knew, they all know that something like this was possible with the shuttle. When you talk to them privately, anywhere along through the Space Shuttle program, they would tell you something big is going to happen one day. If it's not a main engine, something serious is going to happen, and we know it, and we're willing to take the risk, Tom.
All right, thanks, Dan Molina. Now to the White House and Chris Wallace, who has been able to talk with President Reagan. Chris?
Well, Tom, the President came into the Roosevelt Room across the hall from the Oval Office just a few moments ago to give us his thoughts about this tragedy. He said that he had no more information than we did, hard information as to what had gone on down in at Cape Canaveral, but all indications seemed to be, and the way both he and his top aides were talking, was that as if they believe that all 7 of the people on board the shuttle are dead. Let me give you some of the questions and answers in a brief on-the-record, off-camera session that the President had with reporters. He said, it's a horrible thing all of us have witnessed. I can't rid myself of the thought of the sacrifice of the families who were there at the Cape and watching this tragedy also. I can't help but think what they must be going through. He then said that he has no more information, although the White House is now on an open line to NASA, that he and his top aides have no more information basically than we are getting from NASA through the Public Information Officer. He was asked whether or not he's going to halt all systems, all space flights of the shuttle until he finds out what happened. He said, I do have confidence in the people running the program. This is the first fatal accident in 56 flights. Obviously, we want to find out what happened, and so that it won't happen again, and I'm sure that there will be no more flights until the flight controllers are absolutely certain of what went wrong and how to repair it. He said, you know, in the past, some of us have gotten a bit impatient with all of the holds in these flights and wondered whether perhaps the flight controllers were a little overzealous, a little too careful. He said, today we tragically found out that, no, that we do need those precautions. As to the fact that a private citizen, Christa McAuliffe, the teacher from New Hampshire, was on board this flight, he said, look, all 7 of those people are citizens. All 7 of them were volunteers. No one goes on that space flight who wasn't very much interested and very much desirous of getting a coveted seat on the shuttle. He said that the space program is basically the last frontier. I guess we have become so confident that things would go right that it comes as an especially great shock when suddenly something goes so terribly wrong. He said that he will go ahead with a State of the Union message tonight saying that things like that have to go on. We have to go on governing the nation, but he said that obviously there will be a reference to this tragedy during his speech tonight to a joint session of Congress. As for any backlash against the space shuttle, he said no, accidents happen in every line of transportation, and obviously up till now the space shuttle's safety record was perfect. As to who brought him the news, he said that he was in the Oval Office preparing for a background briefing he was going to have with reporters when Vice President Bush and National Security Advisor John Poindexter came in and handed him a note saying that the space shuttle had exploded, no further details. Then the President, Bush, and Poindexter all went to a small study that the President has just off the Oval Office, and like everybody else, turned on their TV to see what was happening, watched, to their horror, tape replays of the explosion. He called it a, quote, very traumatic experience. He said that this will indeed cast a pall on his speech tonight, which he had hoped to use as an opportunity to push his program for the next legislative year. But he said that while they will mention it, you have to go on governing the nation. As for Christa McAuliffe, and there was a certain bitter irony in this because Christa McAuliffe was named to the space program several months ago in the Roosevelt Room, the room where we were all with the President, and at that time it was, of course, a great source of pride to Mr. Reagan, who had come up with the idea of putting a teacher in space. He said that I can't get out of my mind the thought of her husband and her children who were watching as the shuttle exploded. He said, of course, all the other families, many of them were also there, but they, as test pilots, the families of test pilots were more aware of the dangers of this program. He said, knowing that they were there and watching, your heart goes out to them. One other footnote, Tom, we have been told that Mrs. Reagan was upstairs in the family quarters alone and just happened to have the TV set on and was watching live when the flight lifted off and said, "Oh my God, no," and was very upset as she saw live the terrible tragedy.
Thank you. Chris Wallace at the White House today, and as he indicated, the State of the Union address will go on tonight as scheduled before a joint session of Congress at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. NBC News will have coverage of that, and we'll have continuing coverage all day long here. This enormous tragedy involving the Space Shuttle Challenger. All 7 crew members on board, including the school teacher, Christa McAuliffe, appeared to have perished in a giant explosion that occurred 2 minutes after liftoff today, about 18 miles downrange, about 5 miles up in the air. There are recovery crews now in the area, but so far no word from them. They couldn't even enter the area for a time because there was so much debris falling. The most arresting picture so far today, in addition to the explosion itself, occurred at the Cape, where Christa McAuliffe's husband and her 2 children were watching, along with her parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan of Framingham, Massachusetts. They stood silently during the launch, not entirely sure of what they were seeing, I'm confident. They remained standing together as the loudspeaker brought that chilling announcement. There appears to have been a major malfunction. The vehicle has exploded, it was then, they were then told, and Mrs. Corrigan, that is Christa McAuliffe's mother, looked at the NASA official and repeated his words as a question. The vehicle has exploded.
Tom?
This was to have been a triumphant day, of course, for Christa McAuliffe. She was selected by this administration as the first school teacher to go in space, and Dan Molina now remembers a happier time when, in fact, that selection was made.
The 10 finalists, all the testing, training, and dreaming was over. It all came down to this one moment in the White House. First, Vice President Bush announced the backup for the flight, Barbara Morgan of McCall, Idaho. Then, for 36-year-old Sharon Christa McAuliffe of Concord, New Hampshire, the dream came true.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students wouldn't think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me.
This is home in New Hampshire, all spruced up for Christa's return, despite the fact that 5-year-old daughter Caroline doesn't like the whole business.
Because I don't want to go in space, because I just want to stay around my house.
Husband Steve heard the news on the radio.
Everybody who knows her, I think, honestly thought that, you know, there may have been candidates who were certainly her equal, but that there was nobody that would be superior to her.
McAuliffe has already had a taste of what spaceflight will be like. This was a ride in a plane that simulates zero gravity. She'll now go through 114 hours of intensive training. That's, of course, a fraction of what astronauts go through, but enough so she can get along as she takes the flight and records her thoughts in a journal. What, she was asked, does she look forward to most?
Seeing the Earth, seeing the perspective of the Earth, and just being able to see the planet. I mean, you see it in pictures, but be able to see that in reality is going to be wonderful. I do plan to go back to teaching. This is not a career, but it's an unbelievable experience.
Dan Molina, NBC News, Washington.
And apparently it was her last experience, because although we have no confirmation, there is no indication whatsoever that there were any survivors in the crash today of the Space Shuttle Challenger, 2 minutes downrange, about 4.5 miles up in the air. John Palmer's in New York now. John?
Yes, Tom, some of the first rescue teams have apparently arrived on the scene or very near the scene where there was the splashdown of at least the large pieces of the Space Shuttle Challenger and the rocket boosters. They report back that no significant pieces of the shuttle have been found in the water. There is no evidence of any survivors. One theory that is being looked at, we are told, as just a theory by NASA, is that there could have been a rupture in the seam. And Tom, you alluded to this a few minutes ago when they went to full power at about 1 minute into the flight. There could have been a rupture of the seam from the spacecraft and the solid booster rocket. That right at this point there could have been a tearing when the rocket went into great acceleration, its fastest point. But of course that is mere projection or supposition at this point, but it's something we're told they're looking into. And earlier, as we have mentioned, there was a delay of a couple of hours down at the Cape for the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. This because of icicles that appeared on the body of the spacecraft because it was below 32 degrees this morning in Florida. They talked about that a while. They even removed some of those icicles. They were greatly concerned that during liftoff some of these icicles might break off and damage some of those very sensitive tiles on the spacecraft, tiles that are needed for re-entry. But they knocked off some of those icicles. They really didn't think it was any great concern to worry about. There's one other thing that observers at the Cape noticed that was a bit different about the liftoff of this flight, and that was observers say it seemed to be a slower liftoff than they had ever seen before. I was watching it live, and it seemed to me, I thought, in fact, I said out loud to a group who were watching it with me, there must have been a shutdown here. There seemed to be an interminably long time before actually it cleared the pad. That will not be supposition very long because they have all the data there in the computers to check that out. But a number of theories are being considered at this point. Tom?
Thank you, John. Well, it's not unusual for it to look as if it's lifting off very slowly, and of course all the telemetry, all the signals that NASA said it had at that point were normal, so we don't know whether that in fact had anything to do with it. The big external tank, however, is itself a very thin-skinned vessel is really what it is. It holds all that oxygen and hydrogen, and when they do separate, it just breaks up. They don't recover that. They recover the two solid rocket boosters which are on either side. So it is something that could come apart without too much difficulty. Bob Bazell, who's been covering the Space Shuttle program since its inception now, is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Bob, you and I have been talking about this business of going up in the Space Shuttle because we both have been applicants under the journalist program, and we've been talking about what was required. Tell me a little bit about what the people in Houston and really at Cape Canaveral have said to you about what is required in terms of the kind of people that they will put in that cockpit.
Well, interestingly enough, Tom, the Space Shuttle program was said before today's tragedy to have evolved to the point that almost anybody could have gone up. In fact, one astronaut told me that all you really need to know to go up in the shuttle is how to get out in a hurry that's on the ground, and let's get back to that in a minute, and how to use the toilet in the air. And other than that, it was supposed to be a program where just people could be passengers. Now, it is interesting, I think we should probably talk again, as you were mentioning before, about what the emergency procedures were, because I think the people who aren't as familiar with it, who haven't been watching it that closely, might not understand. There was no emergency escape ejection capsule anymore on the shuttle. There was, as you mentioned, as Senator Garn mentioned, in the early days of the program, there were ejection seats for the pilot and the co-pilot. But as the number of people in the crew began to grow, as some of them began to ride downstairs, NASA decided that that was just impractical, and they concentrated on two ways of escaping. One is if something went wrong on the ground, they would scramble out and go down a wire. The other thing was if something happened in the air, they would try to land it either back at a runway at the Cape or, as you mentioned before, to go on to Spain or to try to go once around the world and land at Edwards Air Force Base. So those were the only methods of escape. Now, it appeared from the tape that we've looked at over and over again that there was such an explosion that it wouldn't have mattered what kind of precautions they had. It's also interesting to point out, and everything as we keep saying is speculative at this point, that as you also mentioned, that the external fuel tank that contained that massive amounts of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, essentially a gigantic bomb, is the only part of the space shuttle that's not reusable. So each time they go up, they have a new one. So if we were looking at something that possibly had a defect, that could have been it.
Bob, we're going to look at the tape now once again in slow motion. And this is 1 minute and 15 seconds downrange. There is the explosion. As you can see, it was massive.
It's very difficult to see from the extent of the explosion what might have been involved, because obviously the flames just encompassed everything.
You see one of the solid rocket boosters going off to the right, Bob.
That's right. That seemed to stay intact, but the rest, right. The main vehicle seemed to go just to pieces in a hurry.
Right.
It was interesting that the recovery teams couldn't enter the area because debris kept falling for 15 minutes after the explosion. That was how much debris there was.
I suppose if there's anything to be hoped for, that it was instantaneous.
I suppose that's about it. It was obviously tragic to look. It was obviously tragic to look at those pictures of Christa McAuliffe and his family. But we should remember that there were 6 other people who had families on there as well. And you and I, Tom, know Judy Resnik, one of the astronauts who was on board. As I mentioned before, Dick Scobee was a good friend, somebody who had predicted to me that someday some tragedy like this would happen. So we have 6 families as well as Christa McAuliffe's watching this tragedy today.
Absolutely. We don't want to overlook that. These are, on the other hand, people who know the risks as they go in. They go in as volunteers, and they are taught what the risks are as they go along. There is the crew that you saw today with Dick Scobee in the middle, and it is a tragedy of enormous proportions. There are just too few ways to say it, frankly, except in our own minds. We've all watched this space program for 25 years now, and we've had just 3 deaths prior to this, but now it appears that 7 more today, and it is something in which our national pride is all wrapped up in one form or another, and of course we do feel an attachment to these people, not just to the school teacher, but to the astronauts. They're part of America's folk heroes at this time in our lives. At Cape Canaveral, Steve Delaney standing by at the Kennedy Space Center. Steve?
You were talking a moment ago about watching the space program for 25 years. Jay Barbary has been covering it for NBC radio and occasionally television for a good deal longer than that. You've seen death here before. You've seen explosions before. You were here when that little grapefruit-sized thing blew up back about, what, 57, the first time we tried to get something up in the air.
It's December the 6th, right, 57.
And in all that time, you probably have learned more about how these things work and why they're so careful than anybody else. What does all that knowledge lead you to today in terms of trying to figure out what did happen here?
Well, Steve, it's difficult to understand that it could have happened because all of these systems are fed through computers before they lift off, and all the computers have to write them off, have to say everything is fine. In fact, the flight controllers in Houston, they were saying that everything was fine. No one saw anything. But as we look at the videotape, as it goes back, it's apparent what happened was that the explosion started at the base of the huge external fuel tank. And
that big silo thing, right, and the space vehicle sits on it like a butterfly on a tree stump.
That's right. It's hanging beneath it. They're going into orbit underneath at this time. Now, the ducts that come out of the big tank feed into the engines. And I believe we're getting ready to look at it now.
We
just missed it. Anyway, they feed into the engines.
Yeah.
And it appeared from what we can see on the videotape that that's where the explosion began. Something happened there in the big ducts going from the tank into the engines themselves. And it was right after Dick Scobee was told to go for throttle up, which means they have passed through the maximum dynamic pressure and they're ready to start feeding more throttle.
So they're up through most of the atmosphere and they're heading for outer space at that point then. And your look at that suggests to you that it was indeed that big liquid fuel bomb that took out the rest of it in just an instant as they were getting back into high gear to climb out of the top.
That's exactly what happened. And then the 2 solids went off to the side. We watched those. We saw them continue to burn.
We did see that. Now, where does this program go from here? Is this a crippling or a slow-down blow?
It's definitely a slow-down blow. They had scheduled 15 launches this year, 13 from here, 2 from Vandenberg. The shuttle, none of them will fly again until...
Jay, let me ask you about the recovery effort. You're familiar with the kinds of things that they put out over the water, and you used to do it in drills all the time.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if we have to drop into the water? Well, there are recovery vehicles. But with all that water and bits of debris raining down for 15 minutes after the explosion, what do you expect them to come back with?
Well, I expect a core of some sort of the vehicle is on the bottom of the Atlantic now, and possibly the bodies of the 7 crew members are in that cabin. And if it was not far enough, they say it's 18 miles east of here, it's not off the continental shelf, then it is in water that is shallow enough that they can retrieve the bodies. I think this is what they're looking at this time. They're hoping at least a core of the vehicle did remain. However, we did not see anything but a lot of debris coming down. The 2 pieces that you see on the videotape, the largest pieces that remain, were the 2 solid booster rockets.
All right, so you would have expected, if the orbiter, if the Challenger came down intact, you would have expected to see it, at least in that long-range television shot, after the explosion.
That's correct, Steve.
And you did not? Nobody did?
I did not see it. I don't think anyone did.
Tom, this is your best chance to ask a question of the man who knows more about all this than anybody else. He's here. He has to go back on the radio.
Jay, we've been down there a lot together and separately. There was no indication whatsoever that they were going to have any trouble with this launch today. Was there any feeling going on at the Kennedy Space Center that, in fact, that they may have been pushing the civilian program a little too rapidly?
Question is, were they getting the civilian flights personnel too quickly?
Well, Tom, I don't want to be unfair to the people here, but the thing that you have to realize is that they were going for 15 shots this year, and a lot of the old hands that were here through Mercury, through Gemini, through Apollo,
that guarded this mission, that were very careful. They made sure that everything was absolutely correct before they flew. They're gone. It's a new face that's in here today that's flying the shuttle, and they are doing them. They're talking about doing 24 a year and even 36 a year, and they're gearing up to flying with 2 pads, to flying these four spacecraft at all times, keeping them in the air. So there was a little sense of, yes, you are rushing it too fast. But again, we go back to the fact that the computers okayed it all. Everybody okayed it all.
It was good until it went bad.
It was good until it went bad, and no one knows what happened. And who can say that if they were flying 6 months apart, that this would not have happened?
Jay, thank you. Tom, we don't know any more now than we did approximately an hour and a half ago when we first began to understand the scope of all this. When we do, I guess we'll be back.
Thank you very much, Steve Delaney and Jay Barbary at Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida today. And with me now here in our Washington studios is Marcia Smith. She's the executive director of the National Commission on Space. It's a presidential commission.
Yes, it is.
The future of space does not look very promising this afternoon, Mrs. Smith.
Well, this certainly has been a terrible tragedy. We're not sure quite what the implications are going to be for the long-term future right now. Depends on what the problem was, what caused it.
But wouldn't you expect that there would be a public outcry for the shuttle program to shut down for a good long time until they're absolutely certain that all the glitches are out of it? We've had delay on launch now. We've had weather problems, of course, that have caused some of that, but there have been little problems along the way, and now, tragically, a 7-person crew has been lost.
I hope that there is not a national outcry to shut the shuttle program down, and I'm quite confident that NASA would not launch again until it was quite certain that there was no danger to its crew. So I think that NASA will follow the procedures that it has established for these types of tragedies, as they did at the Apollo fire back in 1967. I'm sure that it will be quite a long time before we see another shuttle launch, but I hope that the public does not suddenly turn against the manned space program.
Conceptually, has the United States had too much of its investment in the shuttle program and not enough in other space programs? As you well know, there are people who are interested in space saying too much money is being spent on the shuttle and not enough on other scientific research programs.
Well, actually, the percentage of the space science budget, which is the people who normally complain about that are the space scientists, and the percentage of the space science budget relative to the rest of the NASA budget has actually remained fairly constant throughout the entire history of the space agency. Now, that's beginning to change now because the operations costs of the space shuttle have become so large and space science programs are now getting cut back. But I don't think it would be fair to say that too large of a percentage is being devoted to the manned program.
We are in a numbers crunch in terms of the budget in this country right now with Graham Rudman and other programs coming along to cut things back. The space shuttle program was supposed to be self-sustaining at some point. That is, that private enterprise would be able to carry the load because of the experiments that were conducted in outer space. That now has been delayed. So there's going to be a real budget crunch, isn't there, for the space program?
It's unclear. A lot of the budget costs in NASA's budget are for operating the shuttle. If we don't have shuttle flights for a year or so while they're investigating this accident, then that money, it may go into redesigning whatever piece of equipment went wrong on this flight. But it could be, in that sense, you know, as terrible as this was, that may be one result of it, that NASA does not have to spend so much money on shuttle operations in the near-term future. I would not think that that would last very long, however, so I don't think it will have much effect on the split between the unmanned and the manned programs.
Do you think that as a society that we've just become too sanguine about space and space launches, that we think that nothing can go wrong because they always seem to go right?
Well, I think that NASA has a very impressive record on manned and unmanned launches, and perhaps we've become a little too complacent. These things are dangerous. The astronaut crews certainly recognize it. It's a risk they're willing to take.
Marcia Smith, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you. It's hard to know at this time, of course, what the political fallout is likely to be, but my guess is that one result of this explosion today on the shuttle program is that the critics of the President's Strategic Defense Initiative, the SDI or Star Wars program, will use this as one more example of just how wrong things can go in space, and that you can't count on a Star Wars or SDI kind of program as a fail-safe defense against an incoming nuclear attack. So that will be part of the equation as well. Here's what happened today, about 1 minute and 15 seconds at about 5 miles up, a downrange about 18 miles from the Kennedy Space Center. Here is the launch once again. For those of you who are just joining us,
solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds.
That's the external tank, the orange tank that you see in the background, and we believe, based on our own speculation, that that may have been the source of the problem. It fuels those engines. Those are the main engines at the bottom of the spacecraft, which is a kind of engine with an airplane with short wings. Everything is normal here.
The 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range.
I'm waiting to get the rest and the insurance.
Engines beginning throttling down now.
Those are the solid rocket boosters, the long white rockets on either side. They are supposed to separate, and then they are recovered via parachute, and the plane, the space shuttle itself, goes on into orbit under normal conditions.
Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs.
APUs are auxiliary power units. Engines at 65%.
57 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Now he's going to tell them to go to full throttle, and that's when it happens.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And there it was. An eerie, tragic beauty in the skies over Florida today. Tragedy of enormous proportions. 7 people killed, we believe. Their families obviously deeply affected, as is the nation, as is the space program. Here it is in slow-mo. It's hard to imagine that anyone could have survived that. The only solid piece of debris we see is the solid rocket booster off to the side. There were no astronauts in that, of course. The Space Shuttle Challenger itself seems to have come apart. Debris fell into the ocean. Recovery vessels were quickly in place, but they couldn't enter the recovery area because the debris continued to fall. They're there now. We have not heard how they're doing at this point. We do expect Senator John Glenn in the Senate gallery within 5 minutes or so. Of course, Senator Glenn is a veteran astronaut. He was the first American to make an orbital flight of the Earth back in the early days of the space program and the Mercury capsule. John Palmer is in New York with additional information for us. John?
Yes, Tom. The Soviet news agency TASS has now made mention of this. Just one line on it. The U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff today. There is no comment. The Soviet Union, of course, is the only other country that has sent people up into space, and the Soviet Union has, of course, reported the death of 4 Soviet cosmonauts. Prior to today, 3 American astronauts had lost their lives. There is this word. According to a spokesman for Lloyd's of London, all of the crew members of the shuttle flights are offered the opportunity for life insurance, written by Lloyd's of London, and a spokesman for Lloyd's of London says that only one of the astronauts, and that was Christa McAuliffe, the school teacher, took advantage of that life insurance. She took out a policy of $1 million on her life. She, along with the other 6 members of the Space Shuttle Challenger, now presumed to have been lost shortly after 11:30 this morning, when the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded about a minute after launch from Cape Canaveral. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw. Tom?
Thank you, John Palmer. There is a problem, and we hope before the afternoon is out to deal with some people who will be here to help you as you deal with your children. We hope to have a child psychologist, because a lot of children have been watching the space program, including the students of Christa McAuliffe. Now at the Senate Gallery on Capitol Hill, Senator John Glenn.
But the people that were on the flight today carried our hopes and dreams along with them, and they'll live forever in our memories. And I guess that's the best tribute we can give to them. Our prayers, our sympathy, our condolences go out to their families and friends, and I guess that's about all we can say about them right at this time. It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was, what, the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be, and we all, I guess, intuitively knew that. So it's a day we don't want to repeat, that's for sure.
Senator, what effect does this have on a space program or any sort of flight test program when something like this happens?
Oh, it delays things, of course, because there will be a very complete investigation. Our view of what happened this morning would be only speculation at this point, although the very slow motion pictures I saw on one of the channels a little while ago seemed to show the first light coming out of one of the solid rocket cases. Whether that'll turn out to be the cause of the difficulty or not, I don't know. But I wouldn't think that this was, what it'll do to the program or how much it'll be set back will be dependent on the investigation.
Was NASA trying to push too hard on this, Senator?
No, I don't think so. If there's one thing NASA has not done all the way through, it is take a chance on cutting corners. And we've grown accustomed to success. And it's been an amazingly successful program so far. I remember one of the TV commentators, I won't say which network, but one morning talking about when there was a delay, commenting, when are we going to get turn this turkey into an eagle? We'd become so accustomed to getting these things off on time that safety was obviously being, at least in that commentator's mind, was being given short shrift. Why aren't we running these things like a regular airline schedule? Well, the fact that NASA has not done that. They run it with the idea of safety first and foremost, and that's been the way it's been operated ever since the days when I was in that program many years ago. It's a tribute to them that they have not been goaded under pressure to taking any chances. And we'll just have to wait the accident analysis to see what happened in this case.
Senator, were you watching the blast off this morning?
I was not. I was in a classified briefing at the time, and one of my staff people brought a note in to me about this, and then I left immediately and went up to my office.
What was your reaction, particularly to the replays you've probably seen?
Oh, my reaction was a profound sense of loss, I guess, that this day had finally come that we'd hoped would never arrive. In some ways, I guess it's, in our human existence, let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
When you say that this was a day that was pushed back for a quarter of a century, was it inevitable that it would finally come?
Well, I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no. But that doesn't mean that man doesn't keep trying in these areas and that we're not just as dedicated to seeing that this kind of research goes on.
Senator, you've been part of a small and very select community of people, the community of astronauts. What does this do to that community when something like this happens?
Well, we've never had something like this happen before, except for the pad fire, or the fire on the pad that claimed 3 lives. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chafee back in '67, I believe it was. So we went through that tragedy then, but that was not an in-flight accident. Obviously, there will be a shared sense of loss in the whole astronaut group and community, everybody associated with the whole program, whether astronauts or all those in the supporting functions. But I'm sure their dedication is going to be to find out what caused this and correct it and get on with the next flight.
Do astronauts just simply accept this as part of the job?
I think any time you go into flying or test flying, or which all of us were in prior to being in the astronaut program early on, you accept risks, but you feel that the risks are worth it for the country and the importance of what you're doing. And you're willing to take those risks. And that's the way we looked at it back then. That's the way I'm sure all of the current group of astronauts looks at it.
How much more of a tragedy is this, since it was the first launch of a citizen in space?
The loss of human life doesn't have much to do with who's military and who's civilian. It's a tragedy for their friends and families, and I don't differentiate between the loss of life, whether it was the regular flight crew or whether it was a civilian on board with them.
Well, how much does it set back the Citizen in Space program, do you think?
I don't know. I have no way of knowing at this point. They had lined up some other people to go, of course. Whether this will affect that or not, I don't know.
Do you think it should?
Does this raise questions for the SDI program?
No, I don't think so, because the technologies that were being used here as far as thrust and the engines and whatever happened here, I think probably are not likely to affect the research going on for lasers and laser projection and formable mirrors and particle beam projection and things like that. I would not think it likely that there was a connection there.
Senator, are you concerned now, or have you ever been concerned about the way NASA procures parts?
No, I never have. NASA has bent over backwards to be as safe as they possibly can be. And whether this will prove to be a one-time difficulty from whatever cause, or whether it will be a design defect that is uncovered now that we can correct, or whatever, we'll have to await analysis. But there's no way of knowing right now, just now, a couple of hours after the accident, to know what happened.
Senator, thank you very much.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.
Senator John Glenn at the Capitol Hill Press Gallery. Senator Glenn, of course, a veteran of the NASA Astronaut Corps. He talked quite eloquently, it seems to me, about the price of advancing human knowledge sometimes requires the sacrifice of human lives, and he spoke with great feeling as well about what appeared to be the deaths of the astronauts today. To his practiced eye, it did appear that the trouble may have emanated from one of the solid rocket boosters on either side of the space shuttle itself. The rest of us who've been looking at it thought that it might have come from the external tank. We don't yet have any official confirmation from NASA if, in fact, the space agency knows itself what may have happened there. There was an accumulation of ice on a very cold Florida morning today around the base of the shuttle where the main engines are situated. We're going to show that to you now, but everything indicates that there was nothing wrong at the time of liftoff today at 11:38 Eastern Time. They had been worried about weather earlier on in case they had to make an emergency landing at the Cape. There were stiff winds yesterday, for example. This is the ice that accumulated at that time. Whether that had anything to do with it, we don't know. We're just trying to show you as much as we possibly can about what was going on there before this accident today, before this terrible tragedy. For those of you just joining us, it appears that all 7 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger were lost when it blew up about 1 minute and 15 seconds into its flight at an altitude of about 5.5 miles altogether. Christa McAuliffe, the school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, was on board. Her husband and 2 children were watching at the time, along with her parents and members of her 3rd grade class carrying a banner that said, "Go, Christa, go." Frame by frame now, this is what happened. That is the shuttle at the bottom half of the rocket apparatus. Now the explosion begins. It's very hard to tell, but it does seem to me that it did not happen within that solid rocket booster on this side of the spacecraft. It could have happened, of course, on the other one. But there is the possibility as well that it might have happened with the external tank. That is the big tank, and we're going to repeat some of this for those of you who are watching us continually here, because we know that people are just joining us along the way. But that big orange tank is, in effect, a bomb. It is a large vessel carrying 560,000 pounds of highly volatile oxygen and hydrogen. It feeds the fuel to the main tanks, which are at the bottom of the space shuttle itself. And as they went to full throttle, from 65% power to full throttle, 104%, it was very shortly after that that the explosion occurred. So it does appear that there may have been some connection between going to full throttle and the explosion itself. And given the size of the explosion and the fact that we saw one of the solid rockets peel off to the side, it appears that that's where it may have happened. At the White House now, Deputy Press Secretary Larry speaks.
Postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday. The President, in addition, has asked the Vice President to go immediately to Cape Canaveral's Kennedy Space Center, along with the acting NASA Director, Bill Graham. The Vice President will carry with him the President's personal concern for those courageous Americans who were aboard the Space Shuttle. In addition, the President will speak to the American people from the Oval Office later this evening regarding this tragedy. The President, since learning of the tragedy shortly before noon, has conferred with Don Regan, who in turn consulted with Speaker Tip O'Neill and Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. They concurred in the President's decision to delay his State of the Union. A few moments ago, the President met in the Oval Office with NASA Director Graham and instructed him to fly to the Cape with the Vice President to begin an effort to find out the cause of this tragedy. And then the President said to go forward with the nation's space program. The President said, and I quote, "These people were dedicated to the exploration of space. We could do no more to honor them, these courageous Americans, than to go forward with the program."
Can you tell us some of the reasoning in the decision to postpone, since, as you know, the President's first reaction was to go ahead with tonight's speech?
I think the President, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror. The President feels that these same emotions are being experienced by people all over this nation at this moment. And with the consultation of Congress that's taken place in the last hour or so, the President thought it was entirely appropriate that his State of the Union be deferred until and let him address the American people on what's happening here tonight.
Administrator Graham tell him finally what happened? Does he have information, confirmation?
No, the NASA has issued a statement indicating simply that there was an explosion aboard the space shuttle shortly after it lifted off from the Cape this morning, and that a search and rescue mission is underway. That is continuing at this hour and will continue until all efforts to find out what the situation in there are exhausted.
Does the President believe...
Right. Great.
Larry, is the President also going to cancel his State of the Union activities for the balance of the weekend? What time is the other remarks tonight?
The President will, will for the balance of the week, continue on his previously announced schedule, with the exception of those activities which were designed as a follow-up to the State of the Union. They will be rescheduled for next week. The time of the address to the nation has not been determined, pending definite word from NASA about the situation.
HHS, Treasury, and the high school he is not going to visit now.
That's right.
Larry,
Larry, can you
let's
tell
go one
us,
at a time.
the President have any plans to travel or attend any memorial service for the...
Well, at the moment, the NASA is still conducting its search mission there, and of course there's been no memorial service set. The Vice President does go with the personal expression of the part of the President of his concern to those families there, and no travel plans are set as yet.
Larry, two questions. First of all, I know you haven't had any official word, but is the White House operating on the basis that all of the people on the shuttle are dead?
Well, Chris, like every American, we hope, and until we find out otherwise, that hope will continue.
And secondly, to follow up on an earlier question, we were told by the President a few moments ago that he intended to go ahead with the State of the Union. In fact, said while it would cast a pall, the business of governing the nation must go on. What changed his mind in really a very short period of time?
Well, as I indicated to your colleague over here just a moment ago, is that the president, like all Americans, watched this on television, and he felt very keenly the emotion that must be felt by the families of those down there and that had to watch this event in person, and very keenly what the American people must be feeling. He consulted with the congressional leadership, and the consensus opinion of the executive and the legislative branch was that it was appropriate to postpone.
Larry, can you tell us what information the president is getting other than from television at this point?
Well, as I just said, the president has conferred with the director of NASA, and he brought him up to date, providing him with as much information as he can. There is not an extensive body of information at the moment that exists. NASA is looking into it as quickly as they can, and as I say, a search mission goes on.